A young woman shipped off as a mail-order bride finds not a bossy husband, but a kind rancher who says she's free to choose her own path. And that's when the real adventure of love and healing begins. That's the hook that'll warm your heart. In this sweet Wild West tale, buddy. Listen up. She was sent as a mail-order bride by her family, but the rancher said, "I'm not here to own you." Boston, Massachusetts, March 1882. Karen, you are going to save this family's honor, not to fall in love. The words fell like cold iron in the drawing room. Karen Monroe stood still beneath the oil lamp's flickering glow, her gloved hands folded. In front of her traveling cloak, across from her, her father paced slowly behind his desk, fingers twitching near the half-drunk glass of scotch he had not touched in hours. He would not meet her eyes. That more than the words themselves told her everything. "So that is it?" she asked. "I am to be sent west like an invoice." "Enough," he snapped. But the fire behind the command was hollow. "You know what this family owes? Your brother's failures, the court costs, the land dark taxes. Do you want the Monroe name dragged through the papers?" Karen blinked once, slow and steady. She was 24. Once the belle of summer parties in silk gloves, now standing like a ghost in a house she no longer recognized. Her mother's portrait hung above the fireplace, serene and unreadable. "Does he know I am coming?" she asked. "He knows enough," her father replied. "He is a rancher, former military, landed alone. He is doing this as a favor. Do not make it harder than it already is." "And what am I to him?" Her father's jaw clenched. "You are what this family needs you to be," and that was the end of it. There was no embrace, no blessing, only silence, and a train ticket placed on the corner of the desk, like a sealed fate. Karen left the room before the tears in her throat could betray her. The butler waited in the hall, his face unreadable as he carried out her single worn suitcase. In the still of her bedroom, Karen opened the box beneath her bed and carefully withdrew two things: a silver hairbrush engraved with the initials KM, a gift from her mother on her 15th birthday, and the worn, leather-bound journal her mother had kept. Inside its pages were pressed wild flowers, clipped poems, and letters never sent. She tucked both into her case. They were the only pieces of herself she intended to bring. The train station was cold. Wind scraped through the iron beams like a warning. Steam curled from the engine like breath from a sleeping animal, vast and unknowable. Karen stood on the platform, her veil drawn just enough to shield her expression. Around her bustled merchants, mothers with infants, soldiers returning west. None paid her much mind. A lady alone in travel clothes was not an uncommon sight anymore. Still, the glances lingered, not unkind, but curious. When the conductor called boarding, Karen stepped forward. Her boots clicked on the wood. The porter offered to help with her case, but she refused. She found her seat near the rear. The bench was firm. The air smelled of coal and unfamiliar leather. Through the soot-smudged window, Boston faded in layers: chimneys, warehouses, cobblestones. Then nothing but flat fields and woods, dissolving into distance. The train lurched forward. Karen did not look back. The days blurred. At night, she shared the car with strangers, a mother nursing a baby wrapped in quilts, a preacher who hummed hymns in his sleep. At stops, the landscape turned foreign: weak plains, sun-split skies, cattle yards. The air grew thinner, drier, less civilized. 1. Evening. An older woman sat beside her, bones sharp beneath her shawl, eyes like cracked glass. "Mail-order bride?" the woman asked without judgment. Karen hesitated. "Yes." "You got his photograph?" "No," she answered, "only his name." "That's not so bad," the woman said. "Photographs lie more than people do." When Karen woke the next morning, the woman was gone, but a small cloth-wrapped bundle of hard biscuits and a hand-stitched sachet of dried lavender had been left behind on the seat. She held it for a long time. On the fifth day, the sun rose, blood pouring over a world that no longer belonged to the east. Karen stared out the window as fences grew scarcer and the sky wider. She pressed her fingers against the glass and whispered to her own reflection, "You are not what they say you are." Outside, the wind howled low over the prairie. She clutched her mother's journal closer to her chest, and the train carried her deeper into the west. The train screeched to a halt at a windswept station that barely qualified as a town. Just a stretch of platform, a small freight shack, and one rusted sign that read, Stillwater, Montana. Karen Monroe stepped down onto the wooden planks, the hem of her dress catching dust the color of old bones. Her boots made no sound, but her heart thundered against her. Ribs. The air here was sharper. It tasted of pine and emptiness. There was only one man waiting. He sat astride a dark bay horse still as stone, his broad shoulders wrapped in a weather-worn duster. A brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but Karen could make out the strong jawline, the weather-creased skin, the way his eyes never left her face as she stepped closer. "Ms. Monroe," his voice, was gravel and low thunder. "I am," she answered, gripping her case tighter. The man dismounted with practiced ease and removed his hat. Samuel Granger. So this was him, her husband by contract, the man her father had bargained her toward like livestock, at auction. Karen tried not to show how quickly her breath caught in her chest. Samuel studied her in silence for a moment, not with desire or ownership, but with something older, more guarded. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of soft brown gloves. "They're old but clean," he said. "Winter's not done here. I figured you did not bring enough." Karen hesitated, then accepted them without thanks. He led her to a buckboard wagon hitched nearby. 2 mules stood waiting, tails flicking at the rising wind. Samuel loaded her trunk onto the back with one arm and offered no help climbing in. The ride stretched in silence. Hills rolled beneath the sky like sleeping animals. Pines cut into the horizon like sentinels. Karen held the gloves in her lap, but did not wear them. After nearly an hour, they passed under a wooden archway marked Granger Ranch. A white farmhouse stood ahead, weathered but sturdy, flanked by a red barn and acres of open pasture. Samuel stopped. "The wagon just short of the porch. I'll bring your trunk in. Your room's upstairs. First door on the right. You'll have your own space. No one will bother you." Karen blinked. I thought she didn't finish. She had expected a wedding, or at least an assumption, a claim staked. Samuel met her eyes calm and steady. "I do not need a wife. Miss Monroe, I need peace and maybe to even an old score with a world I can't change." She narrowed her gaze. "Then why send for me?" He looked away. "Your family needed saving. That was the deal. That's all." Karen stepped down without another word. Her boots touched Montana's soil as if for the first time. The wind moved her skirts like river grass. Inside, the house smelled of wood, smoke, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic. Samuel placed her case by the stairs. "I'll bring up hot water later," he said. "If you need anything, ask Mary in the kitchen. She's deaf in one ear, but hears enough." He turned to go, but before she reached the stairs, he added, "This isn't a prison, Karen. If you stay, it's your choice. I'm not here to own you." She paused on the second step, one hand on the railing. "I did not expect kindness," she said, "only obligation." "Good," he replied. "Then we're even." That night, Karen stood in the small bedroom and stared at the quilt-covered bed. A pitcher of water waited on the washstand. Beside the door, someone had placed a small tin basin, and beside it, a surprise. A clay jug filled with warm water and a hot brick wrapped in flannel. She touched it, still warm. Knock followed. Gentle once. Samuel's voice muffled through the door. Left something outside for you. No rush. She opened the door. On the floor sat a metal kettle with a lid and a small folded note. She picked it up. You might not be used to cold floors. This will help keep your feet from aching in the morning. Karen stared at the note for a long time. Then she brought the kettle in, set it beside the bed, and pulled the gloves from her pocket. They fit. Not perfectly, but close enough to remind her that someone had guessed the shape of her hands. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel sold. She simply felt seen. It started as a quiet pattern. Every Sunday morning, just after sunrise, Samuel would saddle his horse and ride out alone. He never said where, never invited company. He'd return before noon with dust on his boots and silence on his breath. No one questioned it, not Mary in the kitchen, not the ranch hands, but Karen noticed. By the third Sunday, curiosity turned to ache. She was not jealous, not exactly, but something about his absence weighed heavier than she expected. It was the way he looked away when she asked about Sundays, the way he seemed to carry something he never put down. So on the fourth week, she followed. She left 10 minutes. After he did, walking until she was far enough to saddle one of the calmer mares and ride through the back trail without being noticed. The spring wind pulled at her shawl, the air sharp with pine and early thaw. After nearly a half hour, she saw him. Samuel had dismounted just beyond a low wooden gate. A weather-worn sign arched above the fence, its lettering almost erased by time. Still water rest. It was a cemetery, small, old, tucked between two hills like a forgotten thought. Karen slowed her horse and stayed hidden behind a cluster of birch trees. She felt wrong watching, but she could not make herself leave. Samuel walked between the graves until he reached one near the edge. He knelt there, not in haste or ceremony, but with the familiarity of someone returning to a place more real than home. From his coat pocket, he pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Karen squinted. It was a handmade doll, worn, soft, missing an eye. He set it gently atop the headstone, adjusting it so it would not fall. Then he just sat. Long minutes passed. He did not speak. He did not cry. He only sat still as stone with one hand resting on the grass-covered mound and the other gripping a long golden braid of hair tied with ribbon, brittle with time. Karen's chest tightened. She watched until the wind picked up, rustling the birch leaves like whispered prayers. Then she turned away. She never told him. 2 days later, a late frost swept through the valley. Karen awoke with her stomach clenched in pain, her body chilled to the bone despite 2 quilts. She curled in bed, breath shallow, the cold air scraping her lungs like sandpaper. Sometime before dawn, she must have drifted into restless sleep. When she woke again, lights spilled through the lace curtains, and on the bedside table, an untouched teacup, steam still curling upward. Beside it, a saucer with slices of ginger, a folded napkin, and a small tin of honey. No note, no knock. She reached for it, hands trembling, and took a sip. It burned in the best way. She lay back, the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. He knew. The next afternoon, Karen sat on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, still pale, but steady. She watched the wind roll through the tall grass like waves on a wild sea. He did not hear him approach. Samuel stepped up beside her and stood there a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, gaze turned toward the horizon. Then, he stepped off the porch, went inside the barn, and came out with a second wooden chair. He set it beside hers, not too close, not too far. He did not sit. He just looked at the spot beside her for a heartbeat, then tipped his hat slightly and walked away. Karen stared at the empty chair, and for the first time, she did not feel like a visitor. The sickness came in slow, like dusk creeping over pasture. At first, it was a limp in one of the colts. Then, a fever in a mare. By the third week, 4 horses had stopped eating and their gums showed signs of ulceration. Mary whispered the word one evening in the kitchen, her hands wringing a dish towel. "Foot and mouth," she said, voice tight. "It'll take them all if it spreads." Samuel didn't respond. He just nodded once and walked out into the barn like a man preparing for war. Karen knew the look in his eyes. It was the same look he wore on Sundays when he returned from the cemetery. Quiet resolve wrapped in loss. She could not bear to see the same silence fall over the stables. So she began to read. Late at night, under the dim lamp in her room, Karen pored over an old veterinary guide she borrowed from the town doctor, a man who barely remembered her name, but admired her persistence. She took notes, asked questions, and watched how Samuel and the ranch hands handled the animals. But it was the small things she learned on her own, cleaning wounds with warm salt water, mashing garlic into feed, whispering low to keep the sick ones calm. One afternoon, a young mare collapsed in the far stall, breathing shallow, legs trembling. Karen found her first. No one else was around. She rolled up her sleeves. The next 2 hours were sweat, prayers, and careful hands. She mixed a tincture, applied it to the infected hoof, and whispered to the creature like it could understand the weight she carried. She stayed until nightfall. When Samuel walked in, she was still there, her dress streaked with mud and tincture, hair loose from its braid. He did not speak. He only watched as she pressed a warm cloth to the mare's neck. The next day, the fever broke. The day after that, another horse. This one worse. Karen did not wait for permission. She moved from stall to stall, learning with each mistake, growing bolder with each success. Samuel never told her to stop, but she could feel him. Nearby, watching from the barn door, arms crossed, boots silent on the hay, always close enough to intervene. But he never did until the day the stallion reared. Karen had tried to soothe him, an older geeling with a festering sore. But when she reached for the rein, the horse bucked, its flank crashing against the wall. She stumbled backward, caught her wrist hard against the rail. In an instant, Samuel was there. He gripped her shoulders, steadying her, eyes scanning her arm like a field surgeon. "You all right?" he asked, voice tight. Karen winced. "I think it's just bruised." Samuel brushed the hair from her face, hands still on her arms. "I should forbid you from this," he muttered. "You could get hurt." "Then forbid me," she shot back, eyes shining. He exhaled slowly, jaw clenched. "If I did, you'd hate me for it." She held his gaze. Neither of them moved. Finally, he let go and stepped back. "Wrap that wrist. I'll finish with this one." By week's end, 2 of the sick horses had begun to recover. One of them, a black foal with white markings on his nose, stood shakily at the trough, drinking water for the first time in days. Karen smiled. Hand resting on the stall door, Samuel came to stand beside her, quiet as always. She turned slightly toward him. "I read that this one's breed comes from cavalry stock." He nodded. "He was meant for my wife." The last thing I promised her before she passed. Karen looked back at the foe. "He's still here." A pause. "You kept him alive," Samuel said. "Both of them. Maybe more." Karen shook her head. "They'd have made it." "No," he replied, soft but sure. "Not without you." She said nothing. Samuel looked out over the barn, the afternoon light pouring in through the open loft like golden smoke. "You do not have to be my wife," he said, voice low, "but you've become the part of this place that refuses to give up." Karen's throat caught. Not love, but something close. Something real. The rain had started the night before, soft at first, like a lullaby whispered through the eaves. By dawn, it was a war drum. Dark clouds rolled over still water like the sky had turned against the earth. Wind howled through the barn slats, and water beat the roof until voices had to be raised just to be heard. The river that carved its way past the east pasture had swollen past its banks, churning brown and fast. Garin stood at the window, heart sinking. Then came the shout. "Fold's gone!" one of the ranch hands cried, breathless. He slipped the fence, ran straight toward the river. Samuel was already running. By the time Karen reached the door, he had mounted bareback, boots thudding against the mud, rain slicing sideways. She didn't even have time to call after him, only watched as he vanished into the blur of trees. The next minutes were a blur. She saddled her own horse with shaking hands, pushing through wind and branches that clawed at her cloak. The river was no longer a river. It was a flood, angry and full of broken limbs. She spotted the foe first, stranded on a sandbar midstream, legs trembling. Then she saw Samuel. He was in the water, wading waist-deep, arms outstretched toward the terrified creature. The current ripped against him, dragging at his coat, the weight of the river trying to claim him with every step. "Samuel!" she screamed. He didn't look back. The FO bolted as he approached, slipping toward the edge. Samuel lunged, caught the reins, yanked it back. But in that moment, the river surged. A log struck his side. He lost footing. Karen watched as he fell sideways, his head colliding hard against a half-submerged stone. The reins slipped from his fingers. He disappeared beneath the churning water. "No, no!" she cried, leaping from her horse, wading into the icy flood. The cold stole her breath, but she pushed forward, boots slipping, hands clawing at branches and sodden earth. She spotted him. Samuel lay face down against the bank, one arm tangled in roots, the other slack. Mud streaked his face. Blood from his temple ran with the rain. Karen dropped to her knees. "Samuel! Samuel!" She turned him over, hands trembling, mud soaking her skirts. His lips were pale still. She pressed her ear to his chest. Nothing. No, wait. Faint. She began compressions. Awkward, uneven, desperate. "Come back," she gasped, tears hot against the cold. Not do this. Not after everything." She breathed into his mouth once, twice, pressed again and again. Then a cough. Samuel lurched upward, choking on river water, eyes wide with pain. He rolled to his side, groaning, breath ragged. Karen sank beside him, sobbing. She didn't even realize the tears had come until her vision blurred. He turned to her, blinking. "You're crying," he rasped. She wiped her face uselessly. "You almost died." He looked at her, truly looked. Water dripped from her hair. Her hands were scraped, her shawl torn. "You shouldn't have followed me." "I had to." He reached for her hand, muddy, cold, still shaking, and brought it to his chest over the weak thud of his heart. "Do not cry for me," he said. "I've never been worth that kind of grief." Karen's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment. "And if this was the end," he whispered, "I'd want my last breath to feel your hand." She didn't speak. She only gripped his hand tighter and leaned her forehead against his shoulder as the rain fell around them. And for the first time in years, the land held not just sorrow, but something fragile and real. A heartbeat. A hand. Reason to stay. The letter arrived folded in a fine cream envelope, edges still crisp from the city. Karen read it twice, then a third time. It bore her father's handwriting, precise and formal as ever, announcing that the family estate had been sold, debts cleared, reputation salvaged. He was coming to Montana to bring her home. No apology, just an assumption. He arrived. On a Friday afternoon, stepping down from a hired carriage in a tailored coat far too fine for still water. The dust clung to his shoes before he reached the porch. Karen stood at the doorway. Samuel lingered in the shadows of the barn, watching from a distance. Her father removed his gloves, his face unreadable. "You look older," he said, as if it were an observation rather than a wound. "I've earned it," Karen replied. He glanced around. "Unimpressed. This is no place for a Monroe. Your room is waiting. The train leaves Sunday." Karen folded her arms. "That was never the agreement. You were sent to honor a contract. That debt no longer exists. There is no need for you to stay here." She let out a breath, steady but shaking inside. "I am not a ledger to be balanced." His voice grew, sharp. "You've made your point. Now gather your things. I am not leaving." Her father's eyes narrowed. "You cannot truly prefer this place." Karen stepped down onto the dirt, the hem of her dress catching in the wind. "I do not belong to Boston anymore," she said. "I do not belong to you, and I am not a wife. Not in the way you imagined. Then what are you?" "I am part of this land," she said. "I've bled in its barns, buried its sick, learned its storms and its silences. I came here as nothing, and somehow that gave me room to become someone." A pause, then another voice, quiet, steady, from behind her. Samuel. He stepped forward, brushing dust from his sleeves. His presence was calm, unshaken, but his jaw was tight with something unreadable. "If she chooses to go," he said, "I will prepare her horse, pack her food, and ride her to the station myself." Karen turned to look at him, heart suddenly still. "But if she chooses to stay—" He looked at her now, eyes not asking, just knowing. "Then that is her right too." Her father scoffed. "What kind of man gives away a woman like that?" Samuel did not blink, the kind who never claimed her to begin with. A long silence stretched between them. Karen's father stepped back, rage barely masked. "You'll regret this, both of you." He turned sharply, returned to his carriage, and slammed the door. Within moments, he was gone, his presence trailing like perfume and paper money. Karen stood unmoving, the air cool against her cheeks. She did not look after him, only forward toward Samuel. He walked to her, stopping just a step away. "You do not owe me anything," he said softly. She shook her head. "But I owe myself the truth, and the truth is, I am already home." The garden had been silent for years, tucked behind the house, fenced in by climbing ivy and the remnants of what had once been a white trellis. The space bore no bloom, no fragrance, just earth gone hard and cracked, flower beds choked with weeds and rose bushes long dead, reduced to brittle thorns. No one mentioned it. No one entered until Karen did. It was the second week of April when she stepped into that forgotten corner, boots sinking slightly into thawing ground. The wind still carried the bite of winter, but there was promise in the air, faint, like a song she barely remembered. She stood there a long while, hands in her coat pockets, eyes tracing the outlines of what once was. Samuel's wife had loved roses. Karen had never seen them bloom, only heard their memory in passing glances, in the way Samuel's eyes lingered on that corner of the house when no one was watching. The garden wasn't just overgrown, it had been grieving. But grief, she had learned, did not mean it had to stay dead. So she began. Every morning, before the sun fully lifted, she brought a spade and gloves and worked the earth. She pulled weeds until her fingers blistered, loosened soil until her back ached. She bought coatings from a nursery 2 towns over, careful to choose the same varieties she'd once found pressed. Into the pages of the old journal Samuel kept on the mantel. Crimson glory, maiden's blush, yellow tea she planted in silence, not to replace, but to honor. And Samuel, he said nothing, but she knew he saw. On the 4th morning, she returned to the garden and found a burlap sack leaning against the fence. Fertilizer, rich, well-aged, the kind that was usually reserved for crops and kept locked away in the barn. Loft, a small tag hung from the twine. Last year's best. Still good, no signature. She smiled anyway. By the end of the week, the garden had changed. Not in bloom, not yet. But it had been stirred. The beds were shaped, the roses rooted. The trellis stood upright again. There was life beginning, where once there had only been memory. That evening, Karen stayed outside longer than usual. She knelt beside the center rose bush, patting down the soil one last time. Her gloves were stained, her sleeves damp with sweat and dirt. She did not hear Samuel approach. The Faucia R when she looked up. He stood at the gate, arms at his sides, eyes fixed not on her but on the garden. His face was unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly he said, "This was her place." Karen nodded, rising slowly. "I know." He stepped forward, hands grazing the worn top rail. "I couldn't come out here after," he said. "I tried, but it felt like every flower was looking for her. She would want them to keep growing," Karen replied. He looked at her then, not through her, not past her, but at her. "You were never mine to own," he said, voice thick with something deeper than hesitation, something like hope. "But if you choose to stay, this garden will always have room for you." Karen's chest tightened. She didn't speak. She only stepped forward, closed the space between them, and reached for his hand. Mud streaked and calloused like her own. Her fingers curled around his. She did not need to say yes. The way she held on was answer enough. The house was quiet that morning. Karen sat at the small desk in her room. Sunlight, pouring in through the lace curtains like honey. A breeze stirred the edge of a curtain, bringing with it the scent of turned earth and faint roses just beginning to bloom. She opened her mother's journal, fingers brushing over the dried petals tucked between pages, the looping cursive faded with time. So much had happened since she last wrote in it. But today, the silence felt ready. She dipped the pen, hesitated, then began. "Dear Mama, I do not know. If this letter will find its way to you, maybe it is not meant to, maybe writing it is enough. When I left Boston, I was a debt paid in flesh. I boarded that train with nothing but your journal and a silver brush in my bag, and no sense of who I was, without our name attached to me like a chain. I came here as a bride in title, a stranger in truth. There was no altar, no vows, just a quiet man with storm-worn eyes who said he wasn't here to own me. And he kept that promise in all the ways that mattered. He never asked for my loyalty, but he earned it in silence, in warm gloves, in a kettle by the door, in letting me fail and find my way again. He didn't reach into the dark to rescue me. He held still, steady, while I learned how to walk out of it myself. Somehow along the way, this place became more than soil and fences. It became breath, purpose, a place where my hands did not feel ornamental, but needed. I planted roses in a garden where grief had rooted too long. They've started blooming, Mama. So have I. If you were here, I think you'd see it too, that I'm not what they sent away. I'm what stayed. Karen folded the letter carefully, slid it between the final pages of her mother's journal, and placed it in the drawer. She did not lock it, but she knew no one would need to read it. Some truths were only meant to be written. Outside, the world had quieted after weeks of rain. The river, once raging, now moved gentle and clear along its banks, leaving behind only softened earth and polished stones. Karen stepped into the light where Samuel waited. He held out a hand without words. She took it. They walked side by side down the trail behind the barn, past the paddocks, toward the creek bed that had once nearly swallowed him whole. The grass had grown back where the flood had stripped it. The scars remained, but so did the green. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The light of late autumn danced across the water. Overhead leaves turned gold, drifting down like soft farewells. And in the distance, behind the farmhouse, the roses began to open petal by petal, quiet and sure. They did not bloom for the past. They bloomed because someone had stayed. And that was the story of Karen and Samuel. Two hearts bound not by promises but by quiet understanding. A love that did not begin with possession, but with permission. A garden once dead now blooms again, because sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's just someone letting you stay. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest lands, love can still take root, then subscribe to Legends of the Wild West Stories for more tales from the dust, the heart, and the untamed soul of the frontier where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Don't forget to like, comment your favorite moment, and ring that bell so you never miss a story. Because out here, love doesn't just survive, it makes history.